And joining me now from Westminster is Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Senior Research Fellow at NatSen Social Research. Professor Sir John, good to have you with us as ever. Do you agree with Norman Smith's assessment of what Boris Johnson is going to be able to do next, that he's simply going to tough it out with 6 losses in votes in the Commons and a Supreme Court ruling against him?
Oh, sure. I mean, Boris Johnson is certainly going to tough it out for the time being. There's no prospect of him being overturned by his own MPs. And Norman is also correct that he will attempt to turn this to say, look, you know, I'm going to stand up against the wiles and strategies of the Liberal establishment. The potential problem, however, that it presents him with is whether or not the events of the last 24 hours will undermine voters' confidence in his ability to stand up effectively to the Liberal establishment. It's perfectly clear from the instant polling we have so far is that certainly around 3/5 or so of Leave voters think that the judge's decision was wrong. But there's also a hint, and I should say it's no more than a hint, in one of those snap polls that maybe there's been a slight movement back to the Brexit party in the wake of this. We'll have to see whether that's confirmed or not. So the crucial bit that Norman said is that Boris Johnson is going to claim he is leading against the Liberal establishment. The question is, do Leave voters still regard him as an adequate leader of that cause?
We've talked a lot about his, claim that do or die, the UK will be leaving the EU on the 31st of October. But let's move away from thoughts of no deal for a moment to what are the possibilities of him getting a deal?
Well, I mean, the answer is that they're greater than 0, but perhaps they are well short of 100% at the moment. And, we know that the UK government, the crucial thing the UK government has achieved, the European Union, although they won't admit it, are willing to reopen the withdrawal treaty. Not least, of course, because the idea that the backstop will be something that involved the whole of the United Kingdom rather than just Northern Ireland was something that was done originally at the request of the Mrs May's government. The current government doesn't want that, and the EU will have no problem agreeing with that change. The question is, however, is what should replace the Northern Ireland backstop, the Northern Ireland only backstop, which itself is unacceptable to the current government. There's been some discussion about agriculture and food and whether or not there could be an all-Ireland agreement on that. Though again, there's a report in the Times this morning that maybe not even the UK government's proposals on that are adequate. That still leaves the broader question of non-agricultural goods, non-food goods, on which, so far at least, according to the rumours we're getting out of Brussels, the UK government and the European Union don't currently at least meet eye for eye. So it's not clear that the moment at least that the United Kingdom and the European Union are in sufficiently close. They clearly have agreed what to talk about, but it's not clear that they can reach a conclusion.
So with time really squeezed, I was just going to say, with time really squeezed for Boris Johnson to actually get a deal, then, despite those defeats in the Commons, despite that Supreme Court ruling, the thing that might ultimately be his undoing in a way is his claim, his own words that, he would be leaving. The UK would be leaving on the 31st of October, come what may, because that may not be possible. Yeah,
if he fails to do that, it's very clear that there's many voters out there who currently say they vote Conservative that would go back to Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, and that for him is the nightmare scenario. And of course, there is still a question out there yet to be fully answered, which is even if the Prime Minister can get a deal with the European Union, can get a vote in favour of it in the House of Commons by the 19th of October, and that may have got a bit more difficult in the wake of yesterday's developments, is how does he get the legislation that will be required through the House of Commons and the House of Lords by the 31st of October? Shall we simply say the timetable looks very, very tight indeed by the time that it's normally taken for legislation to go through the Commons and the Lords. And having once already been told that, as it were, not giving the Commons adequate time to debate Brexit is not acceptable, he may find that the House of Commons is rather less willing to accept being bullied into a timetable of the Prime Minister's own making.
We'll talk about Labour, other opposition parties in just a moment, but let's have a look at this BBC poll of polls up to date as of the start of this week. So just talk us through this and what this tells us about the state of play, what voters are thinking.
Well, the position at the moment, broadly speaking, is that the Conservatives have a lead in the opinion polls, a fairly substantial lead, but given that the Liberal Democrats are now in a much stronger position than they were in 2017, given that in Scotland it looks as though the SNP will at least hold their own, maybe even do rather better, and could well end up with 50 seats, we have to remember that the Conservatives are likely to need a bigger lead than the 2.5-point lead that they had 2 years ago, just simply to stand still. And if you take the current polls and you assume, and this is a big assumption, that the actual geography will end up still being roughly as it was 2 years ago, you end up discovering that on the current poll position, the government could pretty much find itself with roughly the 317, 318 seats that Mrs May had back in 2017. And that therefore, as a result, there is no guarantee that a general election will resolve the impasse. That said, what's also clear from polling evidence, if the general election, which is now clearly going to happen after the European Union Council, if Boris Johnson does get a deal through, or indeed somehow or another, or indeed is standing on a platform of no deal, then he may well be able to squeeze the Brexit Party vote. On the other hand, if he fails to get a deal through Article 50 is on the course to being revoked and we're going to have another referendum, then the Conservative Party is in deep trouble. So I think we should remember, basically, we can note the polls at the moment, but the crucial thing is going to be, where has the Brexit process got to by the time an election is called, an election is held, and that's going to be after the crucial developments in the third week of October when the UK meets the European Union.
Let's talk then about Labour and the opposition parties more broadly, and Labour's positioning of itself, putting off, if you like, coming down on one side or the other on the leave or remain question. Where is that going to leave it as we head towards a general election at some point in the not too distant future, we suppose?
The answer to that is it's not immediately obvious how Labour's latest compromise position, and it's had many nuances and varieties of compromise positions in the last 2 years, as to how that's going to help it. The problem that the Labour Party faces is that at the end of the day, the electorate are deeply polarised on Brexit. The two most popular options are indeed to leave without a deal if necessary on October the 31st, where Boris Johnson is standing, or to reverse Brexit, which is where Joe Swinson is standing. And the idea of having a referendum, of having a soft Brexit perhaps as an outcome, and a situation where we don't know whether or not the Labour Party is in favour of remain or leave, given where the electorate is at, it's not obvious how that compromise position is going to be more effective than its predecessors at holding up the Labour vote. Basically, the Labour vote fell very heavily during the course of the Brexit impasse in April and May, down to 25% overall, losing ground both amongst Remainers and amongst Leavers, neither of whom seem to be satisfied with Labour's position, and there has been no recovery at all in Labour's position since then. They're finding themselves in serious competition with the Liberal Democrats for being the largest party amongst Remainers, and meanwhile Labour Leave voters, many of them have moved off to either the Brexit Party or the Conservatives. So the question is, how is it going to be the case that this new compromise, and compromise it is going to be more attractive to voters than the sharp, if polarising positions of get out come what may, and just simply revoking Article 50?
Okay, Professor Sir John Curtice, thank you very much for your time today.